Even when I was a child, there's always been a conversation about representation in media, especially in cartoons, which will be my focus in this video. Now, when I say representation, I don't mean how elements in a cartoon relate to each other as intended by the artist. I mean how those same elements relate to the world outside the cartoon, and how they positively correlate with how they exist in the real world. There is a 2001 documentary called Mickey Mouse Monopoly that was the earliest video essay I ever saw that addressed the question of representation in cartoons. Their concern being that because Disney movies were being consumed by children, that Disney had an obligation to accurately represent the real people groups and historical events that they would use in their movies. The last line of the documentary being, quote, "I really believe that as an entertainer, you have a responsibility to be a teacher as well, because you have someone's attention." One of their examples of concern was how Disney's Pocahontas suggested that the romantic relationship between the titular heroine and John Smith brought tenuous peace and understanding between the Native Americans and the European settlers, ignoring the fact that not only was there no romantic relationship, Smith and Pocahontas were about 27 and 10 years old when they would have first met, but Smith was not exactly interested in being friendly with the locals. I was 10 years old when the movie came out, and I remember my school actually having an assembly to inform the students of these important historical inaccuracies. Along with the 1995 assembly, the 2001 documentary, and my love for cartoons, I realized the power of this representation, not just the power to inform the masses, but to sway the masses. A power with great responsibility and also great potential. As a pastor's son and aspiring artist, I saw it as a point of action, a means to proclaim Christ and convert souls in whatever way I could through the animation craft. However, looking back now, inspiring me to create Christian representation was not the intention of the documentary. Along with demanding that Disney had a responsibility to not just accurately represent the life of Pocahontas and the genocide of the Native Americans, the documentary also suggested that because the 1999 Tarzan movie didn't have any African humans in it, there were only white humans and gorillas, that the movie was implicitly promoting white supremacy, ignoring the fact that having more human characters in a completely fictional narrative of a man who was raised by gorillas discovering his human origin would have made it more complicated than a Disney movie needed to be. Along with the concern for racial and sexual stereotypes, I now recognize what the documentary was trying to inspire me to, what we commonly refer to today as social justice warrior talking points. This is why I now refer to the Media Education Foundation, the keepers of this documentary, as Proto-SJW Media, and all of their latest and expensive educational material is available for preview on their website if you're curious. Now, the documentary did address the greater concern of corporate control of information, a reasonable concern that could be hurled at Disney, but it seems a bit pointless in the internet age where concerns for corporate control is an obnoxious cliche that virtually everyone has experienced, and the concern for racial and sexual stereotypes is more or less the preoccupation of joyless busybodies. Nonetheless, in our entertainment glut of streaming services, the conversation of representation carries on, particularly in the representation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual relationships and characters in cartoons. Whether it be the last seconds of a series, a long-standing character, or speculation about certain characters, you cannot go anywhere online without someone celebrating how wonderful, or not wonderful enough depending on who you ask, it is that LGBT characters and relationships are being represented on screen. But as a Christian, I'm left wondering, what's so wonderful about that? According to scripture, homosexuality is a sin, and by my own assessment, transsexuality is a disorder. So when I see LGBT being portrayed and celebrated, I'm seeing sin and disorder being portrayed and celebrated. Once I finally realized this, and ignored the accusation of homophobia that came with it, I came to one realization. The conversation about representation in media, the obligation for art to positively correlate with reality, is fundamentally subjective and ultimately a lie. This realization finally came to me after thinking over a reaction I got from a tweet I made about Disney's latest cartoon show, The Owl House. What's the best way to describe the Owl House for the uninitiated? Imagine the wizarding world of Harry Potter, except it's in another dimension that resembles a Hieronymus Bosch painting of Hades. The main character is a Hispanic muggle who wants to be the first human witch, and is under the care of a super witch who lives like Hagrid, but resembles Ryoko from Tenchi Muyo. Not sure if that really clarifies anything, but that's the gist of it. Anywho, back on Twitter, someone compiled a series of images of the main character, Luz Noceda, together with Amity Blight, a character who transitioned from bully to rival to friend, who now has a secret crush on Luz. The tweet suggesting that the real plot of the Owl House is watching a lesbian relationship develop. To which I commented, does every girl bully character from now on have to be a lesbian? Luz and Amity not hooking up would be the only interesting twist. Someone then asked me, are you going to do this every time a show does this, aka have a gay relationship in it? To which I responded, let me know when homosexuality is not a sin anymore. We then went on a meaningless back and forth, with the person unable to explain how homosexuality was not a sin, but that's a topic for another time. My original response was based on seeing the ending of the Netflix reboot of She-Ra, and I cynically opined that when you ignore all the action in the show, you're basically watching 5 seasons of Catra going from abusive and dangerous to finally admitting that she was in love with Adora. Now, if I was really concerned about representation of LGBT relationships, I would complain that the show subtly implies that lesbians are fundamentally evil and vindictive, especially when they suppress their feelings. You might consider that an exaggerated claim, but that's kind of the point. Remember, this representation is supposedly about how elements of a cartoon accurately correlate with how they exist in the real world, but at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is how a story element correlates with the perceptions of the artist and the audience. There are people chomping at the bit of every cartoon show, waiting for an LGBT element to appear, or looking for a way to insert it into the show through fan shipping. It's one thing to say that LGBT relationships and desires exist in the real world, it's another thing to say that they are normative and good, which is supposed to be the positive element of representation. But not only are LGBT desires not normative, they only exist in about 5% of a given population. The only way the relationships can be good is by the principle that acting on a given desire is good in and of itself. As long as you don't hurt anybody. Actually, if my given desire is to hurt someone, then it is good to do so by that principle. But that's a violation of human rights. Really, where are these human rights you speak of? Because even though I disapprove of LGBT relationships, they can at least be demonstrated to exist. Another topic for another time. The use of this representation only makes sense if its premises are universally shared and objectively grounded. The obvious problem being is that they are primarily subjective and politically motivated. But that's the brilliance of arguing for representation. Merely invoking it implies that you are describing the world as it really is, when really you're talking about what you want the world to be, and implying that the masses fully agree with your dictation. As a Christian, I will never like LGBT representations for the same reason LGBT fanatics will never like bigoted representations. The difference being is that I know that both are lazy political icons. Although bigoted characters can be amusing, and it is really funny when those bigoted characters are unintentionally awesome. See also Archie Bunker.
Hey, Jefferson there, how are you? Listen, that formal invitation you sent by your wife, I think that was very white of you.
That's exactly the way I felt when I did it.
Oh, good stuff. You can't have that on TV anymore, so Ryan Long will have to do.
Sorry, I don't know. I just think we should roll back discrimination laws so we can hire based on race again. Jinx, now you owe me a Coke.
My disapproval of LGBT representation is never going to change, and it's rather amusing that people get all surprised or annoyed that I take issue with it. Now, I'm not actually opposed to having these desires and relationships explored in a narrative, but it's another thing for artists and fans to use that narrative to lie to me about what is good. Of course, if you believe that I am in error in this, and you believe that LGBT is fundamentally good, then please invite me to a live stream and correct me in person. Don't waste time or energy in a pointless comment debate. The point being is that representation in cartoons is primarily propaganda in cartoons, and because of this, the greatest victim is the entertainment value of the cartoons. It's not to say that cartoons with little to no representation in them can't be boring, but I am noticing a correlation between the prominence of LGBT representation and the quality of the show's writing. Specifically, the more often the representation is referenced, the more the writing sucks. It's almost as if the creators don't have to worry about good writing because they can always default to, "Our show is so progressive." The following might be too subjective for any meaningful observation, but I'm going to list off my current favorite cartoons as anecdotal evidence for this phenomenon.
Spoiler warning.
So heads up. First, I have Netflix's The Hollow, a mystery adventure series that has gone on for 2 seasons and has a main character who is gay and another character who has 2 dads. However, these points are barely mentioned twice in the 2nd season, while the show mainly focuses on the narrative of characters stuck in a mysterious situation, figuring out what's going on and how to survive it. Both seasons kept me engaged all the way to the end, and I believe that they are both worth a second watch just to see if all the mystery elements actually work. Second, I have Kipo and the Age of the Wonder Beasts, an adventure series of a girl trying to survive a post-apocalyptic world ruled by gangs of mutants, and also discovering who and what she really is. It has a supporting character who comes out as gay after the main character mistakes a friendly outing for a date and kisses him. It only really comes up again at the end of the 1st season and the duration of the 2nd season because he found a boy that he really likes. But since it's not a prominent part of the story, we mainly focus on the heroes continuing their adventures. There is a kind of lazy, prejudicial allegory between humans and mutants, but overall it is a good show. However, I do find it rather silly that in a post-apocalyptic world where the future of humanity is almost uncertain, that we're seriously entertaining the idea of a committed homosexual union. I mean, just finding humans is difficult enough, much less humans who are willing to share a mostly childish lifestyle. Third, I have Amphibia. After opening a magical box with her 2 friends, the main character finds herself teleported to a strange medieval kind of world that is dominated by amphibian people. As of this recording, there are no LGBT representations in it, with the only downside being that the show is clearly written for younger audiences, even on the few occasions where a relationship is the focus of the episode. Despite this fact, I adore this show. Even with the simplistic art style of Gravity Falls, there is a wit and creativity in the story that makes me want to see what happens next. Fourth is The Owl House, the show that inspired this video. While there is a lesbian character who is reluctant to admit her feelings, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that bad writing has always been a problem for The Owl House, even from the 1st episode. Luz Noceda is not so much a character as she is a collection of nerdy character quirks.
I like editing anime clips to music and reading fantasy books with convoluted backstories.
And her motivation to be the first human witch is as contrived as some of the situations she finds herself in. However, it turns out that the show's creator, Dana Terrace, was determined to have LGBT characters in the show, despite reluctance from certain Disney executives, and also because she's bisexual, she wanted to have a bisexual character. So now we're not just dealing with representation, we're also dealing with a self-insert narrative.
You see this a lot in fan fiction, probably because the natural habitat of the Mary Sue is fan fiction. This likely stems from an author wanting to place themselves in the world of their favorite series, but not their real selves, with all the nasty human elements, their ideal selves.
So an excuse for bad writing was always there. It was annoying when the prodigy witch Ida decided to give up her agreement to teach Luz on how to be a witch and enroll Luz into her former witching school, which I kinda suspect was the story that Dana Terrace originally wanted to tell. But it was even more annoying when Luz was permitted to study every magical discipline, despite her magical handicap and the fact that actual witches are only permitted to practice one discipline for their entire lives. It's also telling that in the prom episode, the beautifully animated dance sequence that confirmed Amity's feelings was made the primary focus over the surprising revelation that someone is currently impersonating Luz back in the real world. While there is room for improvement, as of now I can only hope for an interesting but contrived self-insert Harry Potter fanflick.
Yeah, while you were celebrating your victory, I caught this guy. It means we automatically win. All magic sports are like this.
That just invalidates all our efforts. If catching that thing is so important, why do anything else? There's no reason to watch any of the other players. That's such a stupid rule!
Although I will say in regard to Luz Noceda, it's very refreshing to see a Hispanic cartoon character that is placed in a situation other than Adobe Village, Mexico, or the Day of the Dead. So, points for genuine diversity, I guess. Fifth and lastly is Steven Universe. I'm still making a final video on Steven Universe, but this one needed to be made first. Now, this series can almost be a class on how representation is not only used to compensate for bad writing, but also demonstrates how representation can undermine interesting writing. The most obvious example being Garnet, the living embodiment of LGBT representation. In one particular scene, Garnet explains what her character is, which is 2 sentient beings being merged into one, making a new sentient being.
You know, when you fuse, you don't feel like 2 people. You feel like one being. And your old names might as well be names for your left arm and your right.
This is a very interesting idea, but unfortunately, because Garnet is a living representation, the creators ultimately backtrack in the very same scene.
I embody Ruby and Sapphire's love. I'll always exist in them, even if I split apart.
In the show, there is a background character named Jamie, who is an aspiring actor and who develops a crush on Garnet. But because Garnet is a personified relationship, his crush for her is unrequited. They could have made Garnet Jamie's acting inspiration, but that would have been an interesting development. This actually reminds me of that old article, What Shall We Ask of Writers, written by Albert Maltz, a Hollywood communist. He points out that when a story exists for propaganda purposes, it requires a writer to wrap characters and actions around that purpose, resulting in shallow writing. I also believe that representation prevented Steven Universe from having an interesting conclusion. When fusion was first introduced to the story, and when I saw the gem Empire demonize Taboo, I figured that fusion was going to have a really important part in the final conflict of the story. But since the creators don't know what to do with their own IP, the only thing they could do was make the rulers of the Empire analogous to a dysfunctional and abusive family dynamic. And even though fusion was involved, it was more of an animation spectacle, while the thing that actually resolved the conflict was a line from the pilot episode that technically couldn't count as canon. So what is the point I'm getting at with all this? Plenty of people argue that representation in media must be embraced as a kind of affirmative action in the entertainment world, but that just amounts to having stories tailored to appeal to the racial and sexual politics of certain people, rather than stories that anyone can watch and find interest in. When I watch Disney's Coco, and ignore the bizarre depiction of the afterlife, the Hispanic representation is secondary to the story of a boy wanting to follow his passion for music, which his relatives see as compromising to family unity. In the end, both the boy and his relatives discover a common appreciation in both music and family unity. What's ironic is that people who invoke representation are taking secondary characteristics and dictating how a character must be by them. For example, a man who is gay but views his attraction as a sinful temptation to be resisted would not be considered LGBT representation. Likewise, a lesbian who marries a man in order to have the family that she's always wanted would also not be considered LGBT representation. And don't even bother talking about people who went from gay to straight through either faith or therapy.
You know, I didn't pursue God for freedom of my sexuality, I pursued God for Him. But the outcome of that was that my sexuality, my self-identity began to change. And really it wasn't too much longer after that, maybe within a year, that I began to develop affection for a man, which honestly was shocking. It was a little bit humiliating. I didn't believe that that was who I was. I didn't believe it was possible.
I've spent most of this video arguing against LGBT representation, but I'm not exactly a fan of what passes for Christian representation in movies like Fireproof and God Is Not Dead. Watching documentaries with Christians giving their testimonies is far more interesting and far more useful in the proclamation of Christ than watching Kirk Cameron play a neglectful husband with a porn habit. I hear that modern cartoons function as personal therapy for the creators, which suggests to me that people use representation to compensate for things that they don't have in real life, and I can actually relate to that. When I imagine stories of superheroes, monsters, or grand conflicts, I'm imagining things that don't exist that I would like to have, but I'm using them to conceptualize greater truths, which is the only real representation that matters. The greatest downside with representation in media is that it has a very limited place in entertainment, and since it's propaganda, people will often like or dislike the entertainment for political reasons and not for creative ones. I'm sure there are plenty of socialists, communists, and fascists who are not big fans of George Orwell's Animal Farm, much less the animated adaptation. I imagine that people in the Media Education Foundation will look back at the modern era of cartoons and think that despite all the contrivance and perversion, it was all a step in the right direction. This coming from the same people who saw Disney's original Mulan and thought, why is she pursuing a relationship after the war? Strong women don't need marriage. But there is no pleasing these people, because the thing that pleases them is fundamentally subjective and ultimately a lie. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that other good stuff. Until next time, may the will of God be your way.